there are certain expectations and there are almost assumptions that many people have about oil and its impact, its economic impacts and its political impacts. One of the chapters of Collier's book, The Bottom Billion, of course, is the natural resource trap. It's a trap, according to Collier. Richard Audi wrote a wonderful, which I think ultimately flawed, article where he comes up with the staple theory or staple trap theory that he uses as a model to explain why states that have abundant natural resources, their economies do not perform as well as those economies without abundant natural resources. The other issue of oil or abundant natural resources is authoritarianism. And this goes back to a very old literature in rentier states, basically arguing that states that do not depend on taxation, do not depend on tax revenues, have no accountability. And that those states are self-sustaining and they continue because the leaders are able to fund their activities, including the repressive activities of rule, through the natural resource rents. The expectation is that if you have abundant oil stocks, you're going to be a dictatorship, and you have a shift toward authoritarianism. In economics, there was a wonderful article that came up with the idea of the veracity effect, which basically argues that when there is a shift to liberalize an authoritarian regime that is dependent on natural resources, there are groups that will mobilize to resist that shift toward more democratic rule and bring it back into an authoritarian system, the losers of reform. Well, what I want to think about is Ghana and the Kosmos controversy. There's a second aspect of production of oil, is that corruption is typical in these states. However, I think it's important to think about states, if we're going to talk about oil production, as to whether they are emerging producers, which I would say is a producer that's just found oil. And frequently these countries do not have in place the agencies, they do not have the bank accounts, they don't have ministries, they don't have the structures to manage the oil revenues that they receive. The mature producers do have these structures, but oftentimes you would think, well, that in the emerging producers will have higher levels of corruption. It doesn't always hold that way. Nigeria is a mature producer, obviously. They've been producing oil since 1957. And Angola, since 1968, has been producing oil, and okay, in 1975, then they had, I think if we start looking at Angola, the time to look at Angola is from 2002 on. But again, this is a situation of a country that would be a mature producer. They've been producing for a long time, and they have a lot of the agencies, the institutions that determine the rules and operation of the sector. Declining producers would include such countries as Gabon. Gabon will probably be out of oil in 7 to 10 years at the outside. For a while, it used to include Congo-Brazzaville. Well, Congo, the growth of the Congolese sector is surprising that it has more to do with technology and the ability of oil companies now to drill and extract oil in deep sea, meaning at depths in the ocean of up to 1,700, there are some that go as deep as 2,000 meters. This is extraordinary. And when you look at the technology and you look at what's going on in these deep sea mining operations, it becomes clear that the technology is changing the calculation as to when a country becomes a declining producer. So Ghana. Ghana is a country that has just joined the ranks of oil states. Now, there's an article that a guy named Jeff Colgan wrote where he argues that where you have a certain percentage of the government revenues paid by oil, they're a petrostate. I think that's a little bit mechanistic, but idea that Ghana is now a petrostate is really quite interesting because it's also a democracy. And it's been a democracy, if we want to give it a date, we would say 1992. They adopted a constitution. The Provisional National Defense Council, under Flight Lieutenant Rawlings, Jerry Jeff Rawlings, proposed a constitution by referendum. It was approved. He ran for president. He won. But as someone who's done work in Ghana, it becomes fairly clear that there are certain elements, certain rules and norms that continue in Ghana from the former authoritarian system. And so what happens is that in some ministries, there are authoritarian practices, or in others there are not. And this is important to consider when we think about an emerging oil producer. Because in some areas, these authoritarian, and by that I mean hierarchic authority, where it's somewhat based on a military system, continues. So to think about democracy in Ghana, we can think about it coming in increments. It's coming slowly. And I think it's still developing. And as it continues past the period of the Rawlings, first two Rawlings administrations, in 2000, Rawlings stepped aside as constitutionally mandated, and the elections were run, and John Kufuor came in. John Kufuor served for 2 terms when he too could no longer run, and he stepped aside. And in 2008, there were presidential elections that took place between 2 candidates for the 2 major parties, the New Patriotic Party with Akufo-Addo, and the National Democratic Congress of John Atta Mills. The elections were very close, strikingly close. The first round, they use a 2-round system when there are multiple candidates in the first round. In the first round, Akufo-Addo won 49.1% of the votes. Atta Mills won 47.9%, necessitating a second round. In the second round, Atta Mills won 50.2%, and Akufo-Addo won 49.8%. Now, I cite these figures basically to give some idea of how close the elections were. This is to give an idea, first of all, that this was a hotly contested election, but also because Atta Mills, who is now the president, it says that the loser conceded and allowed a change in role. Ghana has 2 critical agencies of accountability. That this is in addition to the usual police functions. First, Ghana has a serious fraud office. The Serious Fraud Office it's headquartered in Accra, the capital, and in the provincial capitals, it has district offices. It's basically modeled on the British Serious Fraud Office, and it may investigate and initiate prosecution of government or private sector actors suspected of engaging in fraud involving government contracts. This is important. The Serious Fraud Office is an agency of accountability that, in theory, has a great deal of influence on what happens in interactions between the private and public sector. The director of the SFO reports to both the Minister of Justice, or called the Attorney General, as well as the Minister of the Interior. His relationship with the Minister of the Interior is less formal than that of the Attorney General. However, because the SFO engages in a police function, it operates very much, its officers, many of the agency's officers are indeed former police officers. The director may be dismissed at the discretion of the Attorney General, which is an important point because it means that the independence of the agency is compromised. Second, there's the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice. This is the SHRAJ. I always found that phonetically to be an unusual sound, but in any case, they investigate allegations of corruption and they submit reports or advise prosecutors to launch trials. So they will go to the Minister of Justice, to the Ministry of Justice, and they will say they have found the following facts, and we advise prosecution. They do not initiate prosecution, which is an important distinction between the SFO. The SHRAJ is Ghana's Anti-Corruption Commission, whereby they comply with the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, because they're signatories of that convention. It's really moderately effective. It makes recommendations instead of having the discretion to initiate prosecution, so it recommends prosecution. Again, the Minister of Justice appoints the commissioner. However, the SHRAJ, also through its regional offices, does have an influence on what happens in terms of public-private interactions, but it's not as, shall we say, heavy as the SFO. In thinking about Ghana as an oil producer, it's important to consider what was Ghana like before oil. What's the pre-oil economy? It's a major cocoa producer. The Volta region in the east of the country was originally part of Togoland, the British colony. The British were absolutely brilliant in their administration of the Gold Coast colony, and that they set up a stamp system where cocoa producers who wanted to ship their cocoa had to first truck it inland from Ho, which is the major capital in that area, going toward the port in Tema. They had to truck it inland and get a stamp, buy a stamp, before they could then ship it anywhere, because down toward Tema, or if they wanted to ship it out through French Togo via the cocoa line, which the French, of course, were trying to reduce the fares or how much it cost to ship the cargo. Well, the British were brilliant. They set up roads and they set up these stamps. The effect of it was they had administrations in the countryside, in the region, where they collected value-added tax. And this is to this day. They have VAT administrations throughout the country, but the VAT administration was established under British colonialism when it was the Gold Coast colony. And they collect income taxes through regional offices. Now, this might seem to be sort of unimportant, but this is the establishment of an administration that goes back into colonial times. In many oil-producing countries, and we could talk about a whole range of them around the world, this type of administration is actually established after they find oil. The second point is they were a major producer of industrial diamonds. Again, these are through kimberlite shafts. These are not alluvial diamonds, which are most of the gemstone quality diamonds are alluvial, although some do come from kimberlite, but in the most part, we can say that alluvial diamonds are the way where we get a lot of this is what we find in Sierra Leone. It's industrial mining. There is a functioning and active value-added tax administration for the inputs that come in. There are offices that are set up near the mines. There are income taxes and royalty taxes that are levied on the carats that they pull out of these mines. Now again, this is a point that this goes back to the colonial time. These laws date to the 1930s. Thirdly, it's a major gold producer. It has industrial production. It has medium-sized gold mines. In these gold mines, they have value-added tax administrations with accounts in the regional areas. They receive income taxes, they receive profit taxes, and royalty taxes. This is a system that's set up and operational. This is very much unlike, we could talk about Chad, if you like, or a number of other countries where this form, this sort of foundation was not present when they began to export oil. Interestingly, in Ghana, there are several 100,000 artisanal miners who do not pay into this particular system. However, what they do is they have to sell their gold to one of two different boards that buy and market the gold. So they are able to avoid the value-added tax administration for their various inputs that are used to extract the gold from the ore that they mine. The bottom line here is that Ghana has an extensive experience managing extractive industries. So, in 2007, a consortium of oil companies that included Tullow Oil, which is the oil company, it's a British company, and they are active in Uganda. They are the leading license holder in Uganda. Kosmos Energy, a US company, it's a wildcatter. I'll get back to this. It has to do with the size of the company, the amount of capitalization in that company. Anadarko, the EO Group from Ghana, and the Ghana National Petroleum Company. 2007, they announced they hit pay dirt, 60-odd kilometers off of Takoradi. At first, their first determination is what they had found was a reserve of 250 million barrels. It was upgraded to 1.3 billion barrels, and they are finding more and more as they drill further around the Tano Point, the various fields around what is now called the Jubilee Field, which they named for Ghana's Jubilee anniversary. This finding led to celebrations. You can read about these celebrations. I mean, it's amazing doing research on Africa today. One can go right online and pick up newspapers and read the daily newspapers from Ghana, and many of them are available online. And the Ghanaian newspapers talk about the celebrations at the Osu Castle and how Kufuor was opening champagne and making big pronouncements about how Ghana was going to soar and that everything was going to be okay. And this is understandable. These are major reserves. These were major findings. Well, there were controversies that came about. And it has much to do with the nature of oil explorations and the companies that get involved in high-risk markets. Exploration is a high-risk venture. 90% of the wells, on average, worldwide, are dry. Finding pay dirt, as oil people will tell you, is not as common as we might think. It's not like they sink a drill bit in the ground and they come up with oil. Indeed, it's only 10% of the time. This is something that my petroleum engineers have been quick to remind me of, or I learned from my students. So what happens is, because this is a high cost, high payoff venture, the super majors, the Exxon Mobils, BP, Shell, Chevron, Texaco, they avoid high-risk markets. They avoid getting involved in spending the money necessary to explore. So the pattern is for wildcatters, such as Kosmos Energy, to negotiate and acquire licenses to explore. Once they get the license to explore, they go out, they identify an area, they hire geologists, geophysicists who will go out and conduct these studies to see where to drill. These things are all very expensive. The explorations in Ghana were led by Tullow Oil. Now the pattern is that the wildcatter drills, finds the oil, then sells the license to a super major. So they go out and they drill, they find, and then ExxonMobil comes in and says, we'd like to buy the license, and they sell it. And that's where the profit comes in. It's a high profit venture. But they can go out, there are cases where they go out and drill and find nothing. And we were listening yesterday to the discussion of colonial survey maps. So part of what happened at the end of colonialism in Africa, and I've actually gone through these records for the direction of mines in various Francophone African colonies, is that one can go through the archives and read these various reports of lots of dry wells and lots of failures to find ore all over the continent. And this information is available in the archives in Aix-en-Provence if anybody wants to go there. Actually a very nice place to go and spend time. Well, the explorations in Ghana were led by Tullow Oil, which is fairly highly capitalized oil company. It is not a wildcatter. They have a lot of capital. for instance, they are at the present time engaged in investments in floating production and storage offloading vessels. These are very large vessels. They cost millions and millions of dollars to produce, and generally what happens is that oil companies will rent shares of the FPSO. Now these are large structures that are engaged in offshore drilling, and if you can visualize a large ship with a pipe going down, it's a flexible pipe that is able to withstand the currents in the ocean, to a satellite that then has other pipes going down to satellites that are on the bottom where it drills. And there are multiple satellites. These things are extremely expensive. Much of the deep water drilling that's going on in countries like in the reserves off Angola, for example, are being done by FPSOs. This is one of the big shifts in technology which has allowed the deep water mining and oil drilling that we find today. Well, Kosmos entered Ghanaian explorations really without great expectations, but they began negotiations with the government of Ghana in 2004, and they entered with a number of other companies, and they were sharing the risk. So Tullow had a certain percentage of the different fields in which they were exploring, and the spreading of risk was important for the ability of a small company like Kosmos to make it operate. Kosmos received a $300 million loan as private equity funding from Warburg Pincus and Blackstone to begin their explorations. So they effectively borrowed the money. This is a small company. I mean, you can call this company. They're based in Houston. You can call them, and there's nobody there. There's the receptionist who answers the phone, and everybody's out in the field. It's a small company. This was a big deal for these guys. So they get engaged. They then engage a company called the EO firm. It's the EO group. EO is operating as a broker. There's a wonderful, actually I think it's an excellent book by a guy named Stefan Hertog, looking at princes and brokers in Saudi Arabia, where he looks at the system by which people are able to enter particular markets where they have to engage a broker. And that broker serves as a gatekeeper. Now there's a substantial literature in sociology on gatekeepers, but what these people are doing is that they are capturing a rent before it's even created. And they are operating to decide who gets in and who doesn't. So Kosmos has this loan. They engage EO Group, which stands for Kwame Edusi and George Owosu. These are the names of the two men who are actually personal friends of John Kufuor. And they are able to get Kosmos, they get the foot in the door. In return, the EO group received 3.5% of whatever Kosmos would find. Now this is 2004, 2005. As far as they know, they're going to be drilling 10 wells and maybe they'll find one, just statistically speaking. Now their geophysicists and the geologists have determined, okay, there's probably oil out there, but they're not sure. And there have been a number of explorations. I mean, there have been a small field that had been found in the 1970s called the Salt Pond Reserve, which produced a couple hundred barrels a day. It wasn't a large productive facility. So there was this idea, well, we're probably not going to find anything. They found something on the first drilling. And it was unusually lucky. I suppose luck probably has little to do with it, but it was fortuitous. So for the EO group, suddenly they're holding onto 3.5%, over $200 million in equity, at least. The elections come about in 2008. Changes everything. I mean, you could take the counterfactual. Had the NPP won instead of the NDC, instead of Atom Mills, had the opposition party won, what would have happened? Would this have all just been forgotten and Kosmos would have done what they wanted to do? Well, it changed the calculus. The EO group came under immediate investigation from the Ghanaian Serious Fraud Office. Almost immediately after the elections. All right, we're going to investigate this group. The Ghanaian government contacts the Department of Justice in the United States, and Kosmos comes under investigation for Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations. This is a big deal. The FCPA violations are one. We could take the example of the TSKJ scandal in Nigeria, where 4 corporations were involved in bribing Nigerian officials, 8 Nigerian officials who were part of the Abacha administration, for paying over $180 million to these 8 officials. And 8 years later, they all pled no contest to FCPA indictments and paid over 120 each. It was varying amounts, but they paid each of them over $120 million in fines. So these FCPA violation investigations, it's a big deal. It's a lot of money. It's triple damages. So what happened? What prompted this controversy? The elections, I would say. There's no question. The EO group was really very lucky. Kosmos was cleared by the Department of Justice. They didn't find reason to launch prosecution. And it didn't even go to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It stopped. That was it. That was it for Kosmos. So they're in the clear. So the elections came along. Then Kosmos and ExxonMobil began to negotiate a sale of their stake in the Jubilee field for $4 billion. Pretty good deal. $200 million, $300 million loan, and they're selling it for $4 billion. The Ghanaians don't like this at all. They don't like the fact that these 2 guys are getting $200 million. They don't like the fact that Kosmos is about to walk away. So, what do? Well, Kosmos, again, this is a small company. All of a sudden, they're in the big leagues, and these are little boys, if you'll take the analogy. It's a small company, and they didn't do their homework. Had they taken the time to read very carefully the PNDC law, number 84, the Petroleum and Exploration Law that was passed in 1984, to regulate the operations in the salt pond reserve, they would have seen that the law forbids the transfer of information about holdings, geological information about holdings, without prior consent of the GNPC, because it was this law that established the GNPC. The GNPC alleged that the Kosmos had violated this law, A, and B, that they had, as a result, the GNPC had suffered real losses. Kosmos replies, well, you guys are just simply trying to seize our assets to sell them to the Chinese. Now that plays well in Washington, but it doesn't play well in Africa, A, and B, it's really not true. It's true that CNOOC was looking at it, but these are companies. They're operating by the same rules as everyone else. They're operating by the same rules as ExxonMobil. To say CNOOC is the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company is engaging in some sort of manipulation, I think it's just sort of, they're playing by the same rules as ExxonMobil. So maybe they scooped ExxonMobil. So there are questions of the issue that the GNPC was trying to seize this property, and then several months later, after the GNPC itself makes an offer for the Kosmos Holdings for $5 billion, being done through a bridging loan from the CNOOC, which sort of substantiates, in some respects, what Kosmos had been saying. Well, Kosmos refused to sell. Well, this is a case that has certain implications for thinking about what we expect in emerging African petrostates. The expectation of the resource curse and authoritarianism, I just don't think they really hold for Ghana. I do think that Ghana is largely a democratic state. It has the authoritarianism that I talked about at the beginning of this discussion, but in many respects, it is making incremental changes toward representative democracy. The experiences in the extractive industries, especially, are unusual for many countries. I mean, even Angola, which had in 1967 Gulf oil found the reserves in the Cabinda enclave. Before that, they had the Ndiama, which was managing their diamonds in the Lunda Norte region. But they didn't have the same depth of experience that the Ghanaians had going back to the 1930s in regulating and operating this particular sector. And these agencies of accountability that we could debate, you could say, well, really, the SFO is nothing but a part of the government, or you could say that the SHRAJ is a paper tiger. And that's a debate, and in some respects, I think it's true. I've met with folks in both of these agencies, and I have my reservations about them. But on the other hand, they're there, and they're operational, and they do continue to operate. The other point is that Ghana, in many respects, is quite unlike other African states. It's not like Botswana, where the central government controlled, to a great extent, the diamond production and, at its own pace, opened it up to private investment, very much unlike Nigeria, with its auctions, the state controls, levels of corruption. I mean, the auctions, the 2005 round, just thinking about a rather remarkable auction, which at the time was advertised as being the most transparent auctions that the Nigerians had ever held, had a $50 million signature bonus required of each bid, and proof that that bonus was going to be forthcoming. Moreover, the Nigerian government required, this is the Obasanjo government, of course, required that the oil companies have a significant local content element to any bid that they put forth, and that they would also have a drive to, 2 minutes, okay, I'm actually almost done. And they would have a drive to mix the investors so that they would use local corporations. It was fairly strong. Of course, things don't always work out as one wishes. Angola is an interesting case because of its Sonangol, the Angolan domestic natural oil company, is really an extraordinary firm and has high levels of capacity. Its Sonangol is really, the GNPC is not at that level. It's just not at that level of expertise. And there's another issue about what's going on in the Ghanaian oil sector. There's a striking lack of transparency about what happens with the revenues. Because there have been bonuses paid, and there have been revenues that have been coming in. The oil has only just started to come online, but there's a lack of transparency of how that's going to be managed. So what are the possible outcomes that we might see? Well, Kosmos rejected the deal from GNPC. You might wonder why. I think they don't believe that. They probably did an assessment and they didn't believe they'd get paid. There are also questions about the protection of institutions in Ghana's oil sector. The institutions of private property. This is a big deal for Ghana because one of the elements that is present in practically every petrostate around the world is that the governments make a point of convincing investors that their investments are safe, that the property rights will be protected, that those institutions will operate, that they're not going to lose their investments. And the issue in Ghana is that this undermined that security and increased uncertainty. There was an increased risk. And just for example, shortly afterward, the international banks balked at financing a $875 million loan for an oil processing vessel. This was the IFC and the MEGA from the World Bank Group. And then what they did was they said, this is under review until we determine what has been happening with this Kosmos Energy controversy. And this is an ongoing controversy. And I thought, for your information, that this would be a good case to think about some of the major issues that are involved in petroleum exploitation in Africa.